Thank you all very much. Thank you for everybody who's bought a book so far. There are a few left. It was all a terrible mistake. I didn't mean to write a book. I just thought I was going to write some newspaper articles and then have a nice quiet retirement. But you know, sometimes you see a storm on the horizon and you're not quite sure what's going to happen next. I only wanted to tell one story. I wanted to tell the story that my grandma understood by having lived through the deaths of siblings, her husband, one of her children, her parents, because she was born in 1900 with a life expectancy of around 50 years if you were a female infant born in the wrong end of Liverpool in 1900. And so by the mid-1930s, she'd seen people dying. She understood what dying was about. When she was 48, which was in 1948, the National Health Service in the UK started, and life expectancy started to rise. And a really surprising thing happened to her that she discussed with me when I was a new consultant in 1995 or 1996. Now, the mathematicians amongst you will have realized that she'd outlived her life expectancy almost by twice. And the thing that was worrying her was that now that she was in her late 90s and probably going to die at some point, that her children had never seen somebody die. And what would they make of that? And it occurred to me for the first time that the loss of understanding of ordinary dying, the loss of that wisdom, happened over a single generation, which is my parents' generation. And that will have happened in Ireland in parallel. So although we remained in touch with death and the ceremonies after death, we became less and less familiar with ordinary dying because it was happening in hospital and it was happening in an attempt to prevent dying, which if you caught people early enough with reversible illnesses was successful. So dying in hospital became a little bit shameful, a little bit of a failure, a thing that we didn't talk about. So there I was at medical school learning how to save lives, coming from a generation of people who didn't understand dying, and then I got sent out into hospitals to save lives. But I wanted to be a cancer specialist, so I worked on cancer wards and leukemia wards, and people died because the treatments were not nearly as successful as they are now. And eventually when I moved sideways to work in a hospice, I was invited by my boss to come and talk with him to a lady who was very, very afraid of what was going to happen to her as she died. And the thing that she was afraid of was being overwhelmed by pain as she died, because that's what happens on soap operas. That's what happens in the cinema. That's what you read about in the newspapers. So he said to me, "Come with me, I'm going to go and talk to this lady." And I didn't know why he was taking me with him, because I knew people didn't die in overwhelming pain, and I knew quite a lot about pain control, because I was probably in my late 20s, you know, that age when you know everything. So he took me along to talk to this lady who actually was French, and she'd come to England after the Second World War because she'd married the British airman who'd parachuted into France to help her French resistance cell to build radios. And as an elderly lady now, a widow, she'd taken to wearing a little rosette ribbon on her nightdress, which was red and black, and I didn't know what it meant, but my boss's father had the same ribbon because he also had been a hero of the resistance, and he knew what it meant, and he knew that this was a very brave woman. And because he was fluently bilingual, very often they conversed in French in the evenings, and usually when that happened, we lesser beings, you know, the nurses and I, we'd be watching them, and we could see she was flirting with him. So we arrived, and she patted the bed where he was to sit and sparkled at him, and I sat on a little stool, and he launched into talking to her in a very familiar way because he knew her very well. He said, "I heard that you're really frightened of dying in overwhelming pain." And I'm sitting on my stool thinking, that's not the way I would have started this conversation. That's a bit awkward. And she said, yes. And he said, would you like to tell me a little bit about that? And she explained that if she were to die in overwhelming pain, she might despair. And if she were to despair, because she was a French pre-Vatican Council II Roman Catholic, that would be a sin, a mortal sin. And if she died in a state of mortal sin, she couldn't go to heaven. And because her husband had died a few years ago of a heart attack, and a few hours before he died, he'd been awake saying all the prayers with the priest. He was very brave. He had great faith. She was sure he was in heaven, and so they would be parted for eternity. This was actually not about pain at all. This was existential distress. And I wondered what my boss was going to say about it, and I was pretty horrified when what he said was, I wonder if it would help you if I described to you what happens as people are dying. You what now? How can you possibly describe that? I've seen several hundred people die by now because I've been a junior doctor. I've been at the pointy end of medicine. I've been in the emergency room. I've been alongside my cancer patients when they've been dying. How can he explain what dying is going to be like? But she trusted him and she said, yes, I'd like to know. And so he began to describe to her what we see as people are dying. And he said, you know, it's really interesting that as people come to the end of their lives, it doesn't really matter what the illness is. The pathway is very similar. They feel more tired. They run out of energy more easily. They become more weary. And I'm thinking, okay, that's not so bad. And I recognize that that is true from the people that I've seen over the years in outpatients, gradually being less energetic. And he said, you know, I can go on and describe the process, but I would like you to promise me you'll stop me if I go too far, if I tell you too much. And she said, yes, I'll stop you if I need you to stop. So he said, so as time goes by, what we find these people running out of energy discover is that they need more sleep to recharge their energy batteries. And they gradually sleep more, they're awake less, until eventually they are just awake for short periods of time and asleep for most of the day. And then a really interesting thing happens. And I think, oh, what is he going to say now? He said, some of the time when they look as though they're asleep, something happens like it's medicine time or a visitor comes, or there's a phone call, we need to wake them up. We can't wake them up. They're not just asleep, they're unconscious. Do you understand unconscious? Coma, do you want me to say that in French? He says, no, coma, oui, I understand. And I'm sitting on my stool thinking, where's he going next with this? This is really, really uncomfortable. But she is looking at him, she trusts him, she's stroking his hand. And he says, so once people can't reliably wake up at medicine times, we don't want their discomfort to come back. So at that point, maybe we find different ways of giving them their medicines. And then there was a completely unnecessary, I felt, conversation between two people who had French ancestry about the use of suppositories, which I will spare you. And then he explained that usually we use little injections under the skin. We might put the next 24 hours worth of medicines into a little syringe pump that will gradually pump it in so the blood levels stay the same, symptoms don't come back. If the person can wake up, if they are awake enough, they'll go back into their sleep, into their unconsciousness. The drugs aren't causing the unconsciousness, they're just preventing the distress. And she's starting to sit up more and more, and she's looking, her eyes locked on his eyes. And I'm thinking, this is quite extraordinary, because she's nodding and she is drinking in this information. And he said, so as time goes by, eventually people no longer wake up at all. They are completely unconscious, and when we're completely unconscious, the only bit of our brain that's still working is the bit that drives the breathing. So now it's just automatic breathing cycles, sometimes slow, sometimes fast for a while and then slow again, sometimes deep, sometimes shallow. So if your nieces and nephews are visiting and they see you breathing in a shallow way but quite fast, they might think that maybe you were breathless because they won't have seen this breathing before. And we'll check, but almost certainly it's just this automatic breathing. And sometimes families call us because the breathing is slow and deep and people can't feel their throats anymore, so they don't relax their vocal cords and they might breathe out and make a noise, and the family says, is this person groaning? Is this person trying to speak? And we'll check, but almost always it's simply that they can't feel their throats and they're breathing out in a noisy way. I'm on my stool and I think, okay, he must be finished now. He must be finished now. So at the very end of somebody's life, he says, and I'm thinking, alert, alert, can I get under the bed? Is there a hole in the floor somewhere I could get into? I cannot believe that he's still going. At the very end of somebody's life, he said, their breathing becomes gentler and slower, and there are pauses. And sometime during that slow phase, usually there will be a breath out that just isn't followed by another breath in. It's as simple as that. It's as gentle as that. There's not going to be a rush of pain at the end. There's not going to be a sudden sense of fading away. No panic. Just very, very gentle. And she's sitting up and she's stroking his hands, and then she picked up his hands and she kissed them. And then she closed her eyes and she leant back against her pillows, and in her very French way told us that that was enough now. So we walk back up the corridor, and I've got two brains operating at once, one of which is saying, I cannot believe that he has just described dying, and yet I realise I've seen that. I've seen it hundreds of times, but I hadn't realised that there was a pattern because I was the most junior doctor. I was the person who was worrying about this person's oxygen levels and this person's blood levels and this person's potassium levels and this person's kidneys. And I never stood back enough to see this pattern. But as he described it, I understood it, and I understood how many times I'd seen it. He was absolutely describing a truth to her. And he said to me, are you okay? And I said, yes. And he said, do you think we need a cup of tea? And I said, yes. And I went into the kitchen to put the kettle on and do something calming, because what I'd seen was transformational, that we can describe dying. We can describe it with our hands on our hearts and say, this is what people see. This is what we experience. This is what your family will see at the bedside. And provided the symptom management of the illness that the person's dying of is tip-top, then their dying will not be interrupted by physical distress from their illness. And that is a remarkable gift that we can give to people. And that's probably, I think, the second story in With the End in Mind. And the rest of the book is really just that story over and over again, happening to other people. So I wrote that book, and I thought, well, that's going to be an end of it now. I can retire now. And then what happened was I started getting letters. And the letters I got from people said either, this is what I saw, thank you for explaining it to me. I had a letter from a lady who said, I've been in therapy for 5 years since my mother died, because I could hear that breathing. I could hear that rattling. I could hear her groaning. I thought she was drowning. I thought she was in enormous distress. And last night I read your story about that French lady, and I slept through the night for the first time in 5 years. Because although she was having help from a highly qualified professional, she clearly was not having help from somebody who understood the process of dying. And all of her PTSD might have been solved at a much earlier phase if not necessarily a therapist, if the lady she chatted to in the greengrocers or a friend she went out with for a cup of tea understood the process and helped to decatastrophize her thinking for her. I had lots and lots of letters from people saying, you've convinced me we need to talk about this stuff, but how do you start? I'm trying to talk to my parents, they keep closing me down. I'm dying. I'm trying to talk to my adult children. They won't have any of it. Mum, just have another round of chemotherapy. Please don't give in. And I'm tired and I want to stop. Now, it turns out that when you write a book that turns out to be a bestseller, that wasn't a sentence I was ever expecting to say. Your publishers then want another book, and they've been pushing me for another book, and I didn't think there was another book to write. I'd said what I came to say. But because of these letters, I realized that actually maybe I did have something else to say from my experience of those conversations. And that's what the second book is. And it's about this, that if we call them difficult conversations, if we think about them as challenging, if we think that we're afraid as we go into them, we'll metaphorically put our armor on. We'll get ready to have these conversations. And I've had so many letters from people who think that if I could just give my parents a really good talking to, or if I could just give my children a really good talking to, we could get all of this out in the open and it all would be better. And I think that actually we need to do the opposite of putting our armor on. I think we need to take our armor off and come to each other with tenderness and be prepared to be vulnerable and to give each other a really good listening to. So the new book was called Listen, because that's the thing that matters. And to start off with, I was trying to distill listening skills as a kind of toolkit. And then I realized a toolkit isn't going to work, because with a toolkit, you use one tool, and then you put it down and you pick the next one up to continue the job. But when we're communicating with each other, we're doing lots of things at the same time. We're working together, we're collaborating, and it's much more like a dance. And like a dance, it needs to start not with me coming in and saying to you, this is what we're going to talk about. Today is the day we're going to talk about it. But with me coming to you to say, there's this thing that I really would appreciate if we could talk about together. We both need to be ready. When it suits you, please may we talk about whatever this difficult thing is. Let's name it now, so I'm not worried about naming it anymore. I know that you know that I know that you know that this is the thing we're going to talk about, but you'll decide when. So just like a dance, we're issuing an invitation. We know that bereaved people describe people breaking off eye contact and looking away so they don't have to greet them, crossing the road, changing direction, in order not to have a conversation that they are going to find difficult, hard, not sure what to say. And part of Liz's invitation in Shapes of Grief is that we walk towards each other, that we make that eye contact, that we turn up for each other, even if what we say is, I heard your news and I really don't know what to say. That's okay. Because actually the job is not to make it better. There isn't a way to make it better. What we need to do is listen to people and use our curiosity to understand how things are for them. So just like children who just ask questions, they just ask questions, they just ask questions. And from our answers to the questions, they build up a picture of the world. If we meet people who are dealing with dying and death and grief, by being open to listening to them and by asking questions of gentle concern, they will tell us what they want us to know. We might not be the person they want to tell everything to. We need to bring our humility with us. But what will happen is that we will gradually broaden our experience and our understanding of the way that people grieve and what bereavement is about. So what we're doing is using time. This isn't a single conversation. We aren't trying to fix something that's broken. These conversations are part of a process that allows a grieving person to work it out, to look at it from all angles, to be accompanied in their distress. And our job is simply to be there and be their companion, not make suggestions, not tell them what they should be doing, because they will find their own way. One of the most important components of these conversations is silence. Because during that silence, the work is happening, the thinking is happening. Silence is where we think things through. Silence is where we make our decisions. Silence is where we change our minds. And by turning up for our grieving family and friends simply as their family, their supporters, their companions, we will become more familiar with the many different shapes of grief. We will understand what is part of the grieving process from one person to another and what's particular to this individual with this particular loss. And for those of us who work as therapists, we need to bring a proper bereavement-informed, grief-informed training into our therapeutic practice. Otherwise, we're actually letting people down by trying to apply the wrong models or the models we're familiar with in a way that isn't a fit for grief. So I'm delighted to be here. I'm absolutely delighted to support Liz, and I'm really, really glad that we're all here together to do it. Thanks, Liz, for inviting me.